Thank you very much. Delightful to be able to speak here. There would have been many different topics actually that I could have addressed on a seminar on public spaces. But I was asked to talk about interactive governance and the question whether that had any particular role to fulfill in a discussion about public spaces. What sort of public spaces can we envisage? What I would like to do is to talk you through an example and a part of the book. And the example is one in which I think you can see some features of what most people in public policy call now network governance. And the question is whether that is a new public space and how that works, how politics in that particular public space actually works. And the subtitle, Can Deliberative Governance Be Authoritative, is the topic of the book, and at the final bit of my introduction I'll tell you a bit about that. Now, the case study I want to talk about is a case study of planning, and I suppose it's important, actually you saw it earlier in our conference, to realize that we're often thinking from particular paradigms. And before I can turn to network governance as a particular way of doing public policy, I need to say a bit about the paradigm from which that emerged. And there is no picture that brings out the essence of the, what I call classical modernist paradigm in politics better than this one, I think. Here you see Cornelis van Eesteren, who was one of the Netherlands' most eminent public planners, but also one of the leading figures in CIAM, the Congrès International de Architecture Moderne, with Corbusier. And he is now at his work wearing a laboratory coat. So he's working on a new plan for Amsterdam, dressed in a laboratory coat, which expresses his attitude towards what he did. As an academic, he was analytical and had the idea that society was out there and he was actually generating expertise for the benefit of society, but not to be interfered, obviously, by all sort of citizens. And there's a picture of a gathering of people who are working on the new polders, the new polders where there are now cities of 200,000 people in the Netherlands, and they're designing that. And it expresses sort of the traditional, what I call classical modern relations between experts and politics. They come to an advice presented to politics decide, and the citizens are obviously not part of the equation, apart then from the fact they've elected the politicians. Corbusier himself, a fantastic sort of expression of how he thought, at work he was obviously creating the better society, showing exactly how he was going to do it. And then planning, you could say, is in that paradigm, is a combination of two things. And I think it's important actually because it says something about politics as well. So planning then always is about articulation of a vision, and you have to have an analysis of a particular problem, and you have to articulate that vision. That's what planners always would express. But obviously it's also a coordinating effort. You have to make sure that all these services that are then to build that city understand your vision and are able to implement it. And planners will always tell you that what they do is that plan is to guard central ideas, so that not let it slip away. But we also know what happens with this planning paradigm. So here is one of the famous pictures of planning, or in famous pictures of planning, the destruction of the Ego building in the US. The dream of the modernist planning not come true. And actually it was also the rediscovery of the period of the rediscovery of the sidewalks that we discussed earlier. This whole idea of an analytical approach to politics, sort of in planning, you see shattered in when they had to destroy the buildings that just had found to be not livable at all. What emerged in that period, obviously I'm talking quickly through sort of decades of planning, the discovery of participation. Participation as a way to get more information from people, understand better, allow them into politics. And there were hearings. Hearings was the typical expression, so a relatively passive audience expressing concerns that were then to be taken into account, taken along by politicians. I suppose this is also where interactive governance emerged from. We are now in a situation in the early 21st century where participation has become a technology. Participation is something where you can earn your living. There are actually many of the graduates from the Hertie School of Governance that are going to be professional process managers, and their product is participatory processes. Now obviously that's a sort of an outsourcing of something that the state used to do itself, because it's no longer that there are these hearings. Actually there's an incredible creativity in organizing meetings that are generating interest, because people are not always interested in the official government hearing. There are now all sorts of technologies that have been developed and that we have to research for their quality as a public space, a space in which you discuss politics. And the question, I suppose, is what is this new character, this process manager, the people that organize this process, what are they doing to the quality of that public space? Now, what I said so far, I presume you can summarize in two visions. And you can, again, create a sort of an understanding of them by comparing two towers. Now, the first tower would be Sears. That's the first expression of classical modernism. And there you have an idea of a planner standing on top of Sears, having a superior technocratic vision elevated above the chaos of society. The scientific experts are objective and neutral, value-free, and therefore consensus-oriented. They are able, more than we are, to judge what is the situation and what's the best way forward. Politics has to be helped. It has to be facilitated, because it is otherwise not able to speak coherently and strategically. So the expert speaks to politics in his own voice. And the politician then employs these scientific facts to resolve social conflicts. We would have loved to give you more wages, but we can't, because it would destroy the economy. Problem, politics is essentially being displaced. It loses its center. It becomes, we know it as a technocracy critique, and the idea that experts are actually doing the political within their models. The counter vision then, I suppose, is one that is similar to the Tower of Babel. The idea that science is not value-free, but a vision on how to organize social life. So all this science and technology critique of expertise. Politics is unable to stay clear from human chaos, and so are experts. So let the people return to the tower, the participatory revolution. There is no superior vision. There is a multitude of incomparable subjective visions. And openness then leads, the argument would be, to a dumbing down of incoherent masses that are allowed into the tower of politics. And there is a problem that there is an impossibility of reaching an informed, unifying perspective. These two are sort of a dichotomy in between of which we have to find an alternative.
Thank you very much.
I was just getting my water ready. Sorry. That would have been a bit disappointing.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose these are sort of the alternatives. Total participation, which is ungoverned by any sort of expertise or experts guiding politics. And I suppose any notion of deliberative governance seeks to find a third solution in which these two can come together. And these process managers do that too. I mean, I'm not meaning to belittle what they're trying to do. But we have to understand what they do to understand that public space of interactive governance. And I do that by distinguishing two, what I call the genres of governance, because I want to move, I can show you why, away from a sort of evolutionary perspective on governance. Too much we hear talking about that the era of classical modernist governance is now over, and this network governance are the new way of organizing your political and policy processes. And I talk about genres because I think they are in an interesting way getting recombined at the moment. But nevertheless, it's obvious that there is a classical modernist way of governing. It was alluded to several times actually in the conference. And I distinguish 7 points in what that classical modernist governance is, say the Enlightenment model as it was earlier called. It's a territorial political order. Any sort of representative council is always based on a almost always based on a territorial order. It's a system of matryoshkas. They are nested institutions. It's the local fits into the provincial, fits into the national. It's based on universal suffrage. So there is a pre-given public that has interest that gives that to its political parties that then represent it. It's based on the differentiation of politics and administration on a Weberian footing. Science for policy is helping this government. And public participation is then a one-off, add-on, single-level endeavor. That's, I think, the level, what you can distinguish. So one-off, it's sort of in the design of a plan. Add-on, it's fitted in between what experts do. And single-level, it's either for the government on a national level or mostly actually on the local level. And media appear as a messenger of politics. They just give an account of what happens in the political. And on all these 7 levels, you can see how politics has changed and it has become different. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but what I do say, there are 3 deeply problematic features of this model of politics. It's unable to implement its own politics. So there's endless problems with decisions that have been taken, but new things that emerge. The underground system that's much more expensive. There's a learning deficit because it always puts the expertise up front that has to inform the decision rather than that it allows for the expertise to constantly be being mobilized. You can actually relate it easily to what Arkin said. The sort of sites that he was referring to is actually to help remediate that learning deficit. And there's a legitimacy deficit often because the problems can be on a different scale, and people not always respect their political representatives. And what then happens in its stead is this emergence of network governance, and definitely in Northwestern Europe, but also in the US, California, and many different states. You see that all ever more. It's an approach to public problem solving in which we no longer simply rely on the state to impose solutions, but instead conceive of problem solving as a collaborative effort in which a network of actors, including both state and non-state organizations, play a part. So and obviously the crucial thing is state agencies of various levels collaborating with NGOs. Well, international politics, we see much evidence of that. NGOs are doing the implementation, monitoring and so forth because states are unable to do that. These are all examples of network governance. They are now, and that's really fantastic, they are now picked up by deliberative democratic theory as an interesting phenomena. So Mark Warren now has coined his phrase of governance-driven democratization, arguing that this feature of network governance might actually be a new understanding of democracy beyond parliamentary democracy. And he does that, he argues that this might actually be a new phase. He argues that this is, after sort of universal suffrage and social movement, this is another phase of democratization. And he illustrates that by arguing that that is the type of democratization that is now working partly in countries like China, where say a parliamentary democracy is not available, but nevertheless a network democracy is available. Now, I'm not a democratic theorist, I'm a public policy analyst. And I'm trying to understand how do we make sense of what is going on in these things, and how are we to understand what makes network governance better in terms of delivery, for instance. And I have to sort of recoup that perspective that I take, because what the argument ultimately is that we can only sort of understand sort of these new features of governance if we recoup an understanding of what politics has always been about. We have to sort of leave the inclination to think about politics as that what happens in the political institutions that we know so well. And here in the book I refer to a fantastic study. If you haven't come across it, you should really read it, by Jean-Philippe Hertie, who has written a book on the architecture of the parliaments of the French Revolution. And it's a wonderful, detailed account of how the revolutionaries, who obviously had to show their difference from the Ancien Regime, tinkered time and again with the form of the parliament. Because one time they thought, okay, so how are we to sit as representatives vis-à-vis the public, the audience? How are we how do we avoid that we are going to be antagonistic? And every time it was related to the particular shape of the parliament. And what that study then does with the reader is that it makes you appreciate how much the setting that we see as a natural public space of politics, the parliament, is one that was really created to meet particular needs of a particular moment, at that time, the French Revolution. So you could say that politics there was actually about enacted political drama, which then created the legitimacy, that created the possibility for a consensus. Now, using that vehicle, I'm studying all sort of cases of what I call network governance. And what I wanted to show you how I do that and what comes out of it, I take you to an island just south of Rotterdam, the harbor city. It's prided itself for being the biggest harbor, but that's long gone, of course. That's now all in China. But still they say they are the biggest harbor of Europe. And right below Rotterdam is this island, which is now an agricultural area. But obviously there's a lot of pressure from Rotterdam to industrialize this. And I studied that because it was very interesting that in a period of a mere 5 years, 5 different practices of governance were used to structure the future of that island. And I highlight 2. Now, so here is a case where the province said, given the need for more square meters of industrial space, we need to discuss what's going to happen on this island. It opened up for participation. And this dot is crucial because this dot was a sort of nasty way of signaling that they wanted to really industrialize this whole area, but clever they thought they made it into a dot rather than to show the whole area. But people reading the document realized that this was going to have a dramatic impact. And what they basically did, they wrote protest letters, pre-printed protest letters, and so half the population of this island wrote one of these letters to Parliament. It was a deadlock. No possibility to move forward or backward. Now, what was then much more interesting was a cultural manifestation. So here art as a political moment comes into play. It was a manifestation called Architecture International Rotterdam, and it was about how the city should relate to the country. And here you see what Michael Schützen calls the crucial role of monitorial citizens. Here, plans were made that ultimately led people to think, hey, there are alternatives. Politics is not only about ultimately having to give in, you can actually have alternatives. And again, in the narrative, there was a sort of constitutive moment for me that made me realize how important it is to be really detailed in analyzing how these moments of network governance work as enacted drama. My role in this was to be a critic of plans that architects made for the area. And this was the hall where these plans were presented, and there was an auditorium, people were sitting there. And I was making notes before I had to comment, and I said it's a pity that there are no citizens from the island here, it's only experts, and making all these notes, because I had not heard a single voice of a citizen. The 5th presentation was by a group of architects that somehow did something with that meeting. Suddenly, there happened to be farmers. Suddenly, there was a housewife from the island, and they all spoke to the plan. They all related to the plan. Said, oh, you can't do this over there because we've tried that before, it's not going to work, the soil is blah, blah, blah. So apparently there is something in the way in which you present what you do that either creates a public or doesn't. So if politics is can't be can't assume a pre-given public, but actually has to create a public, mobilize a public, then it is really in the details of how that works, how people are able to relate to something. And then, obviously, if you talk about participatory governance, it's crucial to think about the very way in which you precisely do it. So, it led to the a return, I suppose, to a more Deweyan understanding of democracy, where you want to not assume the public to be given, but actually to think about the conditions under which a public can emerge. So it's where the classical modernist governance is one which has the vehicles and people vote and therefore are a public. Here, in this sort of particular way, what you actually do is to look at the conditions under which a public emerges. And what I investigated is how a particular strategy in which what we called research by design, in which analysts no longer give their account of a situation, but actually interactively develop it with people from a particular area, how that creates a particular public. And this is an interesting case of monitorial citizens, because they, first of all, said we don't want it. These were unpolitical people, but that were infuriated by the state action, and then became monitorial citizens, which means that they suddenly were able to act, make all these political activities work, and they put their new plans into the policy process again, and Parliament in the end decided that they didn't want to have that particular development over there. So had this not happened, had these conditions not been met, that case would not have worked that way. So it's a particular condition under which this starts to function as a public space, a meaningful public space, in which I suppose Don Schoen's work on knowledge production is crucial for understanding how it worked. It is sort of an interactive way of developing knowledge, not suggesting that it is something outside participation. No, actually the development of knowledge is in the participation. And there is a difference then from, say, having a linear policy process to what we call a meandering policy process, which sort of sees the need to pick up something somewhere, to become more legitimate, to learn more, and to be stronger in terms of policy output. So here you see that knowledge has a very different role than in the classical modernist era, where the white coats were symbolic for knowledge outside. It actually is a vehicle to create a match of public, problem, and politics. The architects represent this new vision on the island. And I can't go into it obviously right now, but it is reversing the technocracy thesis. So the argument that experts stand in the way of participation is not backed up by empirical evidence in this case. It's actually the particular way in which experts are organized in a policy process that either creates a technocratic model or that allows for participation to become meaningful. Art here is also a crucial vehicle. It is, I think, essential that this was seen as a non-political space, if you want to understand why it worked. And so the interesting thing was that in the audience were all the leading politicians, but they were just uncertain what their role was. It was an art manifestation, so they couldn't say, well, I'm no longer interested in this. No, they had to sit in on this. They were no longer leading, but they were part of the developing discourse. They also used not only analytical tools brought in by the experts, but they also used, say, photos of the area. Or actually they had people send in and make stories about the area. So the idea was much more to appreciate what people thought was important on the island, not only in an analytical way, but sort of to have different perspectives on it that for people made it a much more legitimate way of discussing their future. Now, then planning is sort of different, and one aspect of that I haven't discussed, which is the crucial role of a mediatized context for policy making right now. So it is a situation in which mediatization disrupts politics all the time. The experts are concerned and want to press on, but administrators are distressed about polling results. Citizens are less inclined to be, say, oriented towards the political ideals and are more individualized, and the press is often very cynical about what happens in politics. And in that context, I think you want to think about what could be a sort of a reorientation of political processes, taking these sort of new public spaces into account, having a sort of an understanding of a republic. Now, what this particular case then brings is that you see that expertise and art are actually able to bring together citizens and their associations, administrators, bureaucrats, and firms. And all by virtue of being what John Forrester calls a safe space. So it's allowed to be looking for new ways of being together because it is quasi-non-political in the first instance. It's also a space, and that's where I think network governance is here to stay, that allows to bridge levels. So there were parliamentarians present. It was no longer add-on single level. It was actually a multi-level governance that was created in this particular space, and it was mediatized. So they had journalists actually being part of these monitorial citizens, being part of the people from the area that made sure that all the media moments were captured, and a story of an island that sort of rediscovered itself was brought in the news. To get to a conclusion, so interactive governance was the question, is that a new public space? I think it might be if we understand politics as a sequence of enactments through which discourse and decisions are established. So I'm not moving away from what is pre-given, what's in the law in terms of required participatory moments, but I take an extremely inductive view in the sense that I'm just looking where discourse is produced on a particular problem, that with the idea that discourses ultimately shape decisions. Now, it's one thing to show that indeed this produces a particular view on an island, but another, of course, whether that actually then leads to changes, whether it indeed finds its way to a new model of planning and a new organization of the space. And to answer that, you have to be able to say something which sort of often makes people wonder, why are you interested in authority? That's a question I often have to answer. They say, you are all interested in democratic participation in governance. Why are you interested in authority? Well, I think it has to be addressed because there is too much of this sort of network governance that is meaningful in terms of developing views, but is not strong in actually influencing real, let's say, state decision making. And so I have investigated sort of the different way in which these two models, classical modernist governance and network governance, how they could gain some authority. What the authority mechanism of the two styles of governance is. And the argument in the book is that you see that authority, and that's actually, Klaus, you wrote about that, and Mark Bohr picked up on that in the 1996 article. You argued that our understanding of authority is often sort of neoliberal understanding, which suggests that it is appropriate that authority belongs to state agencies. And he sort of, in that article in 1996, tries to show that there might also be a possibility for authority based on deliberation. And actually, if you go back further in the literature, you find that Karl Friedrich actually made that notion much more explicit. He had an understanding of authority not being based on who you are, not being based on some foundational source, but being based on the capacity to allow for reasoned elaboration. That was his phrase. So authority is something that comes out of a particular way of communicating. And now that's interesting, of course, because that could be related to network governance, where classical modernism is, of course, an authority based in parliaments with their architecture, with their positions, and is therefore also very easy to mediatize, right? It allows the White House to be shown in pictures, the president with his rituals, the opening of the parliamentary year. It's a whole list of media moments that sort of reinforces that understanding of authority. Whereas network governance likes to be in the shadow. Nearly all sort of network governance is a matter of policymakers sitting in rooms, working on finding solutions for practical problems, and they don't like the media. The media don't like them because they don't have a face. It is an anonymous backstage development. So, where the public policy scholarship and the public administration scholarship argues fiercely in favor of network governance as being a far more able way of trying to solve public problems, in mediatized contexts keep reinforcing a classical modernist politics. Now, what I try and do in the book is move away from the idea that it is moving from one to the next. And I do that by identifying 4 bases for authority. And this is the sort of the classical modernist moment of authority. It's generated following institutional rules and conventions, and it's then accepted by a passive public. But what you see happening is that a lot inside classical modernism there is a move towards personified politics of style. Style becomes much more important, so that the actor returns, so to say. And you see that also actors can fail, even if they're backed up by classical modernism. If you fail to perform in situ, in a particular situation, you can actually lose your authority in a mediatized environment. The people see your mistakes. They actually go to YouTube to see it again and again and again. And my argument is here that the relationship with the public is one of monitorial citizens. They're not necessarily interested in politics, but they might suddenly become interested. They might be switched on, so to say, if they don't like what they see. But nevertheless, it can also be the other way around. You can be authoritative for the particular way in which you perform. And it's really tempting to talk about the mayor of Bogota, actually, in terms of these 4 vehicles of authority, I think, because I think that one of the qualities that he brought to the situation, apart from all the sort of very clever public policy steering theories that he had, was as an authority of authenticity. So he mobilized his own personality in a situation of corruption to be, well, this person, the way in which he behaved, his personified politics of style, was one of somebody who was clearly not interested in Porsche and in a big Mercedes or in a country house. He was the one who wanted to run government. He was authoritative because he was authentic. So something like that. And people monitor that. They monitor his behavior and adjust what they do. I suppose that is one of the arguments that he was making. Now, this is then sort of the deliberative governance corner, where you say that authority can be generated by deliberation, but then the source of authority is the discursive interaction in the network, but often, as I say, without the public being involved. Now, my argument in the book is that we do far too little here, and that is that authority can also be generated by enactment using the staging of deliberation, that politics should return to its drama, and that politics is also a matter of a dramaturgy, that you can script politics. It was interesting to hear him say that as well. Right? He's scripting particular policy processes. And what you then want to cater for is a joint experience of politics, creating relationships between policymakers and publics. Now, in the 3 cases that I discuss in the book, I actually come to the conclusion that indeed network governance can be authoritative if it employs these 3 authority bases jointly. And the critique on deliberative democracy theory is that they fail to take this into account, are far too much oriented towards optimizing the situation under which the particular rules of deliberative democracy, inclusion, reciprocity, and so forth can be created. So what did I try and achieve? I think that indeed we are looking for new public spaces in network governance, but it requires us to reconceptualize what they are about. at the moment they are often not at all public spaces, because they have a tendency to become technocratic spaces, actually. They are not, because the characters operating in them are not interested in connecting to the public, and I think that is something that is to be thought through, akin to what Hertie accounted for what happened in the time of the French Revolution. So deliberative network governance is a chance, but only also if it takes into account the new context of mediatized politics. And when I was writing this book, I found, surprisingly, that there is a whole literature on governance, network governance, and a whole literature on mediatized politics, but these two fields don't seem to talk to each other. So the mediatized politics talks about a classical notion of politics, and governance, well, they don't talk about the media. Hardly. But Lance, I hope you give me useful references to rethink what I just said. Which requires to broaden the authority base. If you want to be able to perform in a mediatized polity, you need to be able to also deliver on personalized, personified style politics, and to create stagings of moments, which is only possible if you think it's not bad to think about politics as drama, but it also might be a key to a new sort of vibrant political life. And then, indeed, interactive governance might be a new possibility to represent that politics in the classical sense of the word. Thank you very much.